All right, Zach, our rankings here. Now, if you're listening on podcast, I'm going to read the rankings off so that way you know, and then we'll get Zach's thoughts on the differences between mine and his. Zach's rankings first, he had Dillon Gabriel, Emeka Ibuka, Quinshon Judkins, Tez Johnson, Miller Moss, Drew Aller, Donovan Edwards, Kyle Monangai, Jonah Coleman, Colson Loveland. And then I had Dillon Gabriel, TreVeyon Henderson, Donovan Edwards, Quinshon Judkins, Will Howard, Drew Aller, Miller Moss, Evan Stewart, Emeka Ibuka, Kyle Monangai. Now, before we get Zach's thoughts, this is not a ranking of the 10 best offensive players, all right? So don't come after me and be like, JR, you don't think Tez Johnson's one of the 10 best offensive players? Okay, that's not what this ranking is saying. This ranking is saying these are the 10 players we feel have the best chance, not necessarily they're the best player, but the best chance to win the award. I don't think it's accurate that every single year the player who wins the best offensive player of the year award is the actual best offensive player. You don't even have offensive linemen in this award right here. So at the end of the day, I mean, I guess you could technically, but it's never going to happen unless you're Orlando Pace or something like that. They just don't get that kind of love. But yeah, so like I said, not a ranking of the 10 best offensive players in the Big Ten, just a power ranking of who we think is most likely to win the award. Zach, thoughts on your rankings and what stuck out to you, the differences between mine and yours?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, the thing I was most surprised by was you have TreVeyon Henderson second, and I don't have him on my list. And it's not because I don't think that he's great. I love TreVeyon. I think in my mind, I was like, I think he's going to lose a lot of touchdowns to Quinshon Judkins, and I thought that might be a big hindrance to him. I thought, yeah, and I think Tez Johnson's probably going to have more volume than Evan Stewart. Jonah Coleman, I think, could be a dark horse if Washington makes some hay, because I think he's going to be a focal point in that offense. And then I think you told me off air, Colston, you have Colson Loveland. He's not on your list, but he's like 11th.
He's 11th for me, yeah.
And I think he is the offensive guy that I think, aside from Donovan Edwards, where he's going to get the ball, he's close to the line of scrimmage, he could still have high volume despite a bad quarterback situation. So that was some of my thinking. Probably the biggest thing I'll explain, I think Emeka Ibuka is in for a dynamite season. And part of the reason why is Chip Kelly was talking about how he wants to use him in the running game. They can move him to all three positions in the wide receiver room, slot, X, Z. I just think, and I think Jeremiah Smith, and this is part of my reason why I didn't have him first. I think Jeremiah Smith by game 6 or game 7 is going to end up giving so much of a problem to opposing defenses that you can't double Emeka anymore. And I think it's just going to, like, I would not be surprised if he outpaces Marvin Harrison in terms of yardage, despite the fact that I'm not sure they're going to throw as much as they have the past several years. So that's kind of, I think Miller Moss and Drew Aller being on, big teams, we have them pretty close together. I'm kicking myself a little bit not having Will Howard on here. I think there was a part of me that was like, I think the hype is just down on him. And so I just didn't have him on the list. But I think as I saw him on your list, I was like, he's going to have some rushing touchdowns. He's probably going to have some running highlight plays. He's probably going to have at least 25 to 30 touchdown passes. That was a poor decision on my part. So that's like my very real concession on this.
Well, and honestly, I don't think it's a bad thing not having Will Howard on there, because at the end of the day, like, I think this is totally a season where you can see all the skill players for Ohio State getting the love and getting the credit, and the quarterback doesn't quite get that love and credit as much as the other players. I mean, you think about what Ohio State just came off of last year. They just came off of having Kyle McCord, who was not a bad starter, right? I know Ohio State fans get a bad rep for saying, like, Kyle McCord was terrible. Am I glad Kyle McCord left? Yes. Do I think that Kyle McCord is bad? No, I don't think he's bad. I just don't think he's what this team needs. I think they need somebody who has more of a running threat. I think that Kyle McCord at Syracuse is going to do a fantastic job, and I think he's going to have a very good season. He might put up better stats next season than he did this season, and people will say, oh, Syracuse develops better. No, that's not. Stats are not everything. But I do think that, you know, at a certain point, like Will Howard, yes, he is going to get credit, but if you have a fantastic rushing attack, you're going to see TreVeyon Henderson and Quinshon Judkins getting more of that credit than anybody else. Last year with Penn State, you saw Drew Aller take much more of the flack for some of that offense than you saw Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen take. Now, I think Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen are both fantastic players, but they did not have the season last year that they had their very first year. Wasn't Nick Singleton had a really low rushing average, and Katron Allen, I think it was Katron Allen, just didn't have the touchdowns that he normally had from his freshman year. So that was a huge thing for them. And I'm going to sound hypocritical here, but I'll explain in just a second. I didn't have Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen on my top 10 because I didn't know which one to put up there. I thought to myself, which one do I put up there? Because I don't think I could make room for both of them up there because you have to put Kyle Monangai in there. You have to put Emeka Ibuka in there. And I had to put one of the Oregon wide receivers in there, whether Tez Johnson, Evan Stewart, and then, of course, you have the quarterbacks as well. Now, the reason I put TreVeyon Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, both top 5, is because I think both of them are getting a lot of hype this year, and one of them will separate. It just depends on which one. I think it'll be TreVeyon Henderson. I think TreVeyon Henderson has more explosive, like, speed and ability to break off the big runs and kind of get the love that way and then have the really high yards per carry average. But Quinshon Judkins, he's more of that, I mean, guy that you're going to give the ball to within 20, 30 yards, and he could break away. And it's not necessarily an 80-yard run, but it's a 20-yard run. It's a 30-yard run, and he could have more touchdowns. So we'll see how the season goes. At this point, one of those guys will probably be in the top 10, but I don't think both of them will. It's just at this point, we'll see which one is. And then you and I both agree, Dillon Gabriel, he's the favorite to win the Heisman. He's most likely going to win this award by year end.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And I even if Oregon finishes 10-2, like we projected, if Dillon Gabriel's going to have the stats, the offense is going to look great. And I just think he's going to outpace everybody.
Yeah, no, I agree. And if anybody here is saying like, you know, JR, you're a homer, you have 4 Ohio State players in your top 10 of offensive player of the year. Go look at who's won the last 6 offensive player of the years in the Big Ten. It's Ohio State. They've won the offensive player of the year all of the past 6 years. Marvin Harrison Jr., CJ Stroud, Justin Fields, was it Dwayne Haskins in 18?
Dwayne Haskins, JT.
Yeah. So what, 18, 19, it started in 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. So yeah, the past 6 years have all been Ohio State players. So like, yes, I get it. It makes me look kind of like a homer, but at the end of the day, it just, when you look at history and how things work, and that was another reason why I didn't put wide receivers as high as you did, Zach, is because historically the award is won more by quarterbacks and running backs, just because of how much the persona of the Big Ten is. Did you give thought into that, or what was your thought, like the history in the past?
That's why I was a little hesitant to put Tez and Emeka as high as I did. I think the reason why, particularly Ibuka, is I just think he's going to have the volume. I think the way Chip has talked about him, I think it's going to be hard if they use him the way I think they do. I think he's going to outpace a number and I think Miller Moss. I think Miller Moss, Drew Aller, those guys have a lot to prove, but also I'm not convinced that their teams are going to do well enough to really be in that conversation. Whereas I think Oregon obviously does. So,
yeah, I think you have to put Drew Aller in there just because he is one of the only returning quarterbacks in the Big Ten, and he has like the draft people about him, and he does have, some hype. I mean, there's some people that just absolutely dismiss Drew Aller, which I don't think is fair, but I think he does have some hype. And then Miller Moss, I mean, if you're a USC quarterback, Lincoln Riley's your coach, you're going to be in the top 10.
Yep.
I mean,
Yep.
maybe the question is more where than if you are in, but I mean, if you're a Lincoln Riley QB, yeah, you're in the top 10. No,
Yep.
no questions asked.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Good.
so
Good
we'll
thought.
see. We'll see if anybody can break Ohio State's streak here. I think it's either Oregon or USC. Donovan
Mhm.
Edwards could if he has a really, really good year. But
I had a
let me ask you
yeah.
this really fast. Do you think we will see Donovan Edwards be a bell cow back where he is just getting all these carries and being run into the ground? Or do you think we'll see more of the Kellen Mullins and Jordan
Khalil
Marshall?
Mullins. Yeah.
Yeah. Or do you think we'll see more of those two guys and kind of even it out? And so Donovan Edwards won't quite have the yards and the touchdowns. I mean, Blake Corum had 1,000 yards last year, but he had tons of touchdowns, right? I mean, that
Yeah.
was one of the reasons why it's so considered. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah. I'm not sure. I think they might try, but the way I was on the OHIO podcast. I was the Michigan representative for the OHIO podcast.
Wow.
And yeah, I don't know how
That had to hurt your Ohio State heart a little bit.
I wore an Ohio State jersey during it. It's like I can't do this. But my comp, and I'm not saying they're the same player, but my comp for Donovan Edwards was Curtis Samuel because I think I think he's a good slash back. He's got some wiggle to him. He's got a little bit of power, but I think his strength is being a 10 to 15 carry back and then getting routes out of the backfield and starting out in the backfield and then motioning into being a wide receiver. I think that's his go-to, which is why I think Jordan Marshall, for both of us, is going to have a good freshman year because I think they're going to need Mullings and Marshall to really step up.
Yeah, I think they will, and that could definitely impact it. And if Jordan Marshall, I mean, if he flashes, you could start seeing 50-50 carries between Edwards and Marshall, which it sounds like he's been doing really well in practice, so could see it. Brian Myers is here. Thank you, Brian, for being here. He says, Will Howard is being underrated. He's a great fit for Chip Kelly's offense. I agree. He is being underrated by a lot of people. There's people out there saying, like, he's just like, Kyle McCord, which it's like, have you watched the two of them play? No, he's not. I get it. It's mostly just poking fun at Ohio State fans, which, we always like to poke fun at other fan bases, so I get it. But yeah, he is a great fit. Like I said, and I don't know if you were here when I said it, Brian. I just don't know if he's going to get the credit. Like I think the credit is going to go more to the skill guys this year. But we'll see. Will Howard, I mean, if he has a bunch of rushing touchdowns and has a bunch of rushing yards, I mean, 400, 500 this year, and 8 or 10 touchdowns on the ground, it could happen. Definitely could. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, what was it in your calculus of Evan Stewart over Tez Johnson?
So I think Tez is going to be utilized a lot in the games against like the lesser opponents, and I think that Evan Stewart is going to be more of that playmaker against some of the bigger teams. And so my thought process was like, if Evan Stewart is having the big highlight plays against Michigan and Ohio State and USC, then I think he's going to get more love, even though Tez Johnson might have more yards. I think Evan Stewart might get more love as kind of like that playmaker, kind of like last year. Marvin Harrison Jr. didn't have the best stats out of anybody in the season, but he was looked at as like he was the one catching passes against Michigan. He was the one making the big plays, and Kyle McCord was throwing the ball up to when he didn't have anybody else to throw to, or he just decided to throw the ball up.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That makes sense. That's a good logic.
Yeah. Brian also says, don't think Edwards will have a good year. It's the only threat for cheat again offense. Stop him, and you stop the cheat weasels. I love all the ways of trying to put the word cheat into other stuff. I love it. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. He seems to have a little bit of a different mindset this year. Seemed like last year at media days, he was talking about last year. He was kind of uptight when he wasn't getting the ball and Blake Corum was, and he said he's got a different mindset this year. So we'll see. I mean, it's always easy to say that in the preseason, but when you get in season and Jordan Marshall is out there instead of you, what are you gonna do? We'll see. Brian also says the threat of him running will open up the passing game. Talking about Will Howard. Yes, it definitely will. So, all right, Zach, we spent a good amount of time there on the offensive players. Anything else offensively before we move on to defense?
No, I think a lot of this is going to get sorted out in those middle weeks of the Big Ten. Like I think the Ohio State Oregon game is going to be a big factor in this. Oregon USC, Michigan USC. Like I think that's where you're going to really see a lot of these separate. So fun to talk about now, but like I think week 7, week 8, we're going to have a much better idea.
I agree.